Have you ever wanted to know more about the hidden history of Jiu Jitsu in America, including details even most experts don't know? If so, you should sign up for BJJ Mental Models Premium. Hi, I'm Jeff Shaw. I'm a professor at Western Washington University where I teach a history of martial arts class, and I'm also the head instructor at Bellingham BJJ. BJJ Mental Models Premium will give you access to my course, This Is Why We Fight, History of Jiu Jitsu in America, which is 12 classes, including a bunch of research that you can't get anywhere else. You can get it for free for the first week and start learning right away. Plus, you'll get access to a bunch of other amazing courses by people like Emily Kwok, Dominika Olenite, Stefan Kesting, and other experts that I learn a ton from. So if you are interested, BJJ Mental Models Premium is your way to go.
Hey everybody, welcome to BJJ Mental Models episode 403. I am Steve Kwan, and BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and I am back again with an old friend from Rochester Jiu Jitsu. I've got Brennan Strimple on the line. Brennan, how is it going?
It's going great, Steve. How are you today?
I am doing well as well, my friend. Thank you for coming by. Now, one of the things that we've chatted about in the past, you came on and we talked about some of the strategies you guys have had for building up kids programs. There's a list of coaches I like to talk to when it comes to how to train kids and how to teach kids. And I think that actually everyone should think a bit about how to teach kids, because there's a lot you can learn about how you would teach the rest of the class if you understand how children are taught as well. Not to say that they are the same, but there are definitely crossovers. So we're going to get into that today. Before we do, though, just as a quick reminder for the folks, do you want to tell everyone a bit about who you are and maybe introduce the gym you're from?
Sure. So my wife and I founded Rochester Jiu Jitsu back in 2014. I've been training Jiu Jitsu since then, teaching classes. We started as a karate class and karate school, teaching kids that. We transferred over to teaching them jiu-jitsu only for pretty quickly. We found it to be a lot more effective and they learned it faster. And we've been doing that ever since. So, myself and a few owners, we run the school and we put a heavy emphasis on kids. I think one of the big differences is like almost all of our kids' classes are taught by black belts rather than just hiring, blue or purple belts to run the program. So we really put a high effort into running the kids program and trying to raise up a future generation of athletes.
Fantastic, sir. Well, I will put a link in the show notes and all of that stuff, but let's get into the topic here. Tell me about what you've learned from teaching kids over the years. Give me kind of the high-level concept of what you think people need to know if they've been tasked with starting a kids program and they don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, so I started running a kids program, as a blue belt, and I thought it was going to be easy, teach the kids like we would teach adult class. And it fell apart. Like, it was an absolute disaster. And I had purchased online curriculums and things like that. And I'm like, how on earth are you going to get all this material to the kids? Like, they weren't able to handle like any of it. We would spend a class on trying to do guard passing, and we were getting, a quarter of the way through what we were trying to cover and get them to learn. So I quickly learned that you cannot run your kids program like a little adult class. And the kids are very different. They learn differently. And not just that they learn differently, but the biggest idea was that they grapple differently. They don't grapple like adults. They have their own problems that they deal with. So we in jiu-jitsu like to talk about problems and problem solving. The problems are different. The moves that they need are different because the problems are different. At least to start, once a kid has been grappling for a couple years, then they start to look more like the way adults would grapple. But to start, that was the biggest thing, and trying to give them solutions to adult problems when they're grappling like kids, it was absolutely falling apart and it had no effect for them.
Well, maybe give me some examples of that. Like, what are some of the things you found where you realize that teaching kids and the way they do things is quite different from the way that maybe you would handle a room of adults?
So you can start from standing all the way down. Like, kids really can't handle the intricacies of grip fighting. They stand completely upright. Their back is so straight. We call it standing on a hot dog line. Like, they're standing around waiting to order hot dogs. And so trying to do snap downs and all collar ties and things like that is not super effective for them. Learning to 2-on-1 Russians or arm drags or anything like that. When the kids first start, it really it doesn't work well. So getting some kind of initial grip, just like posting the shoulders and getting to the legs, turned out to be way more effective for getting takedowns than trying to do setups and things like that. And that would be standing. For guard passing, they trying to teach them a guard pass was not super effective. They got caught in the weeds and trying to do moves and would miss the general idea that they needed to just get to side control or to mount. The kids had so little guard retention that like they really didn't need a guard pass. That wasn't a thing for them, and then they would get to side control or they would get to mount, and rather like showing them a technique like a submission, Americana or whatever, for example, they would just fall over so quickly. Like they would get bridged and they would be on their back, and then they would get guard and they're like, yes, I got guard, I'm winning. And, trying to teach them like where to go and what to do in that manner, it wasn't working. So that kind of caused some of the changes that we did. And I think it's been working. Implementing some of the changes and some of the changes we want to talk about today really helped get kids going.
So when you say that those techniques didn't work the same as adults, I presume you're saying not because of any physical reason, but mostly just because kids have to learn in such a certain way, and there's different ways to layer on the info. And so the reality of the situation is at the early stages, you just don't have kids who have like the proper posture that would enable the kinds of things like a snap down, right? So it's not like the move doesn't work. It's just that you're being practical given the constraints of having young kids who are there in class for maybe just the first few sessions.
Yeah. So, teaching a snap down, for example, if a kid is standing completely upright and they kind of have this sort of lackadaisical look on their face, like, oh, haha, you can't take me down. Like their shoulders are completely over their hips, their head is over their hips, getting that snap down positioning. So it works well. Like they're not giving it, they're arching their back so much, they'll stop one technique, completely giving up 3 others that would be way worse for them. But they're feeling proud that they stopped that one technique. So they get pigeonholed and, like horse blinders on for stopping moves, especially if it was a move of the day. They'll never let anyone get that, but they'll give up their back or something else. And that was happening with guard passing. The kids would, like you'd try to start a guard pass and the kids would just turtle away as fast as they could and stand up to their feet. And so the kids that were passing really didn't need a good guard passing game. They needed like a decent front headlock game and then a very rough sketch of a go behind. And then that like drastically increased their ability to score on each other because the kids weren't playing guard, or if they got close guard, they would just hold on to it for dear life.
Well, interestingly, that is a challenge that comes up with adults too, where they realize pretty quick that, hey, if I just don't cooperate, a lot of moves I can just shut down by not being a willing training partner. I guess the most obvious example is if someone is constantly ready for a double leg takedown, it's not a great time to shoot a double on them because if they're ready for it, they're just going to sprawl on you right away. And that can be frustrating for beginners, not just kids, but adults as well, because they think like, well, every time I try to do a double, it never works. And we have to remind people, well, that's because you're in a training room with people adopting a jiu-jitsu posture who are expecting a double leg. And it's easy to shut something down if you know what the other person's going to try. If you had to do this in self-defense, you're unlikely to wind up with someone who's going to take a wrestler stance on you on the street, right? You're going to have a much more upright approach. So this can lead to a bit of early frustration where they're thinking, well, this just isn't working. But we have to then layer on that extra context of, well, that's, that has to do with the situation that we're in. And I think that you've got a good point, which is when we get beginners, especially children, where they can run out of patience very easily, we want to give them something that they feel is effective and rewarding. And if you give them a move that just is impossible for them to do out of the gate because it's easy for the other person to shut down, I can see that attacking the confidence a little bit and making them think like, I'm giving up here. I want to move on to something else. This isn't fun anymore. And man, you know how it is with kids, right? It's so important that it be fun at all times, because if they get bored or frustrated, then they might just move on to something else or lose their interest.
Oh yeah, for sure. They definitely need to be smiling and enjoying themselves. But we run our room, like this is a sport room, like a wrestling room. It's not just all fun and games. Especially now, we run it pretty serious and we have pretty strict discipline. They are having fun and they work, and we do a game, like usually an athletic based game at the end, but it's like, we don't focus solely on the fun. We're teaching them how to have fun by being successful and learning how to feel accomplished and things like that. And so we try to make sure that they're having fun, but because they're successful, not just for the sake of having fun. We're not a daycare service or something like that. Like, our goal is to teach good jiu-jitsu.
Makes sense. Now, you had said that it's important to clarify for children what their goals are. And man, this gets into the topic of language selection. I want to make more content about this. It is so important that coaches use the right words to communicate intent to their students and to clarify what needs to be done. How does that work with children? Because you're inherently dealing with people who have a much more limited vocabulary and probably attention span than adults. How do you clarify the context around what the kids are trying to do in a way that is maybe more resonant with children than it would be for adults?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we do is we try to teach them the jiu-jitsu language, and I quiz them every class, what are you supposed to do from here? And, they'll start telling me frame or shrimp. I'm like, okay, those are tools to get the job done, but like, what is the job? And they need to use the proper terminology. And so I teach it to them. I don't just expect them to know. So like escape, pass, sweep, submit, takedown, whatever the situation they're in. And this was one of the biggest insights that happened is because when I first started, I was teaching the kids techniques because, that's what I learned and you teach a technique. But I really got into teaching tasks and goals to accomplish rather than moves for the sake of moves. And that alone made it an enormous difference. Like what is the goal you're trying to accomplish? And then just make up something, whatever you want to do to get the job done. And it's, so I would say that this would be, I'm not super well versed in ecological dynamics and all the terminology there, but I would say to start with kids, I definitely go more in that direction, but not creating games to get them to do a guard pass, like a knee cut pass or whatever. I just give them a game and a task so that they find side control or find mount, chase the back, things like that. And then as they start to learn to battle, I teach them the points. Teaching the points helps a lot, and they have to understand when they've won and when they've lost, because for adults, they inherently know that being on top of the fight feels good and being under someone's body weight feels bad. The kids don't necessarily know that. And so teaching them points and I use reversals as points, not just sweeps. If they are on side control and they fall to the bottom and get guard, they're not winning now. They were just scored on. That was a 2-point move. And they're like, oh, their eyes get big and they're like, he just scored points on me. And they're like, I can't let that happen. And reinforcing it a few more times, pretty soon their matches are starting to look the way we expect a jiu-jitsu match to look. And with that structure and getting them looking good, once that framework is done, then you can start to give them tools to actually accomplish their tasks. And that's when bringing in guard pass techniques would work, or, mount transition techniques, or, actual strangles and things like that. And so that's the path that we follow now. And that's the one that I would recommend anyone starting up a program is teach them tasks first and not guard pass tasks, not more detailed, eco games like adults would do, but like, okay, you can do both. Mount, back, side control, and that's it. And if you get that, you win, stand up, do it again, and rinse and repeat that until what they're doing starts to look like a jiu-jitsu match.
Yeah. That's actually a challenge I struggle with a lot as I think about how to better communicate ideas in jiu-jitsu. My feeling has always been that, look, if I can just give you a simple, quippy goal or explanation of what you need to do, it's going to be easier for people to understand. However, the challenge is that sometimes you lose the nuance in doing that, right? I mean, if you and I wanted to talk about how grip fighting works, we could sit down and talk about the difference between a direct control grip and a proxy control grip. And suddenly this turns into a high school essay where we're just throwing out terminology. And it's good to know that stuff at a certain level. But sometimes for beginners, it's easier to just set the goal that hey, don't let them grip you. If they grip you, deal with that first. And even that, especially for kids, might be too complicated. So then you can turn that into a game, right? Dirty paws, don't let them grip you, keep their hands off of you, stuff like that. And this kind of creates almost this staircase of understanding where you start with these really simple games and ideas. And as kids get practice doing it, eventually they can really learn the conceptual framework and the details around why you would do something like that. But I think, again, the mistake is probably getting into that too early. And I also like what you said about not just trying to upload moves into your kids' brains here. We've said that many times that for adults, that's also not an optimal way of teaching, or at least I don't think so. You've talked about how really what you're trying to do with these kids is build athletes and not just some robot who can do jiu-jitsu moves. Maybe talk to me about what that means holistically. What does it mean to build an athlete? Because when I see so many kids programs, like you said, most of the time it's some blue belt who is voluntold to teach the class. There isn't much of a plan. It is basically a daycare session in a kimono, right? But that's not really the optimal way to actually build athletes. If you're thoughtful about what you want to do with this program and how you want to actually help kids, you probably need a more comprehensive approach. What does that look like?
So every class that we do, I have a certain set of warm-ups that we do as part of things. I love having the kids run and do sprints. I love having them do handstands and bear crawls. So, to back up a second, I want to train their lungs. I want to get them so that they can grapple for a long period of time, because they're going to learn the best when they can grapple. And so they need the cardio for that. If they're getting tired and they're kind of flopping over on the mat, it's not going to be a productive session. And if they're feeling too exhausted, they don't have the mental toughness yet, we have to cultivate that to progress in jiu-jitsu. And so we always start with conditioning and not running circles around the mat. I make it fun. I have them do races or I have them play tag for a few minutes. Anything to build their cardio but they don't really necessarily realize they're building their cardio. From there, I move into functional strength training for the kids, especially for escaping and guard retention. They need to have solid frames. And at this level, they not only are they not necessarily strong enough, but they don't necessarily have the body coordination to hold their arms out straight and keep someone off of them. I mean, that requires balance and someone's moving around and you got to be able to frame on them. That's difficult. And so every class we practice handstands on the wall. And so they practice holding each other or holding themselves up in handstands. And I have progressions I go through. So if that becomes easy, then they can go to a harder thing, so that we don't have to spend, 10 minutes doing it. We only a couple minutes. But that I found personally, because I did a lot of handstand work myself, that really strengthened my neck, strengthened my frames, learned how to use straight arm strength and stack my bones. And so I found that to be very helpful for the kids. And so it looks like general athleticism, and it is, but we're really they're muscle groups that they're going to need for jiu-jitsu.
Got it. That makes sense. I mean, kids are super active, but a lot of it is running around type active.
Yeah, it's frantic energy.
Yeah, anyone who's done jiu-jitsu knows that, man, the first time you try this, it is going to target muscle groups that you didn't even know existed. You could be an amazing CrossFit athlete, but the first time you've got to go onto your back and fight with your legs, it is a completely different experience from anything you've done before. So that's a good point, right? With adults, we often talk about how maybe it's not effective to load up the class with too many calisthenics because adults can do that on their own time, but that implies a degree of planning and targeting that an adult will have that a child isn't. A child is not going to think about how I need to work on my core strength, so I'm going to go do sit-ups. They're just going to do whatever's fun and whatever's presented to them. So if you make this part of that class, then you have the ability to get them that practice and help them in that area. You would also mention that kids just fundamentally grapple differently. Tell me a bit about what that means. What is different about the way that kids do it? And are we talking about actual different things that they can do or something beyond that?
So we touched on it in the beginning. So when kids first start, they do different things than adults would. They hold their body different. They react to pressure different. They wiggle differently. Sometimes it looks like they're having a little seizure when a kid is totally brand new, or they're so floppy that their joints are going to get dislocated if the pressure is too much. So, they present different problems for their opponents than a typical, adult would. And so part of what we do is to get them so their matches look more like a traditional jiu-jitsu match, with the takedown and playing guard and passing and things like that. So getting the kids so that they're starting with that rough sketch and going towards the ability to actually hold a match and hold their own is a big part of what we do. And so we separate the kids out between beginners and intermediate kids. And the fundamentals kids, the beginners, they don't have a lot of techniques. It's very task-based. And so they're learning kind of just how to grapple, how to move, giving problems that are going to be more serious threats to their opponents than, just kind of charging at them and charging head first with your back arched, which is something I see. It's a very odd thing, but kids love to pass the guard with their heads. And then they do this almost like Shamu where their back is arched and their feet go up over their head and then they roll over and now they're on the bottom. And it's quite interesting, and getting that habit broken is certainly a challenge. But I see that all the time. And they dive in and they pass the guard with a headlock. And so getting the kids so that they're good at getting to the back and having good headlock defense is super important. Where adults, you'd show them side control and they're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. And then they almost immediately they start passing to side control. And so side control escapes become much more relevant for an early jiu-jitsu student. But with kids, it's they got to be able to get out of headlocks, because the kids will grab each other in headlocks from every random position you could possibly imagine, and then they'll start to squeeze. And so it wouldn't make sense, because they're exposing their back, they're exposing arm locks. They don't realize that, though. They feel it, they have a headlock, and they are going for it. And even if because adults will go for headlocks too, especially newer ones, but you won't usually see an adult wrapping up a headlock with their back fully arched and their feet almost getting close to their head. It's a very peculiar thing, but like that's something that happens and that I've seen. And so I've seen some interesting things over the years happen with kids, and kind of building and getting these habits out of them is definitely a challenge.
When I watch kids do jiu-jitsu, it often feels like for them, they almost don't even realize or care that this is intended to be a combat art. They're just playing around, right? If something is fun and in the moment, they'll just do it. And a lot of that time that leads to silliness and things that aren't exactly great fight strategy. You're right, though. I mean, even if you're interested in this being super practical, if you want to teach your kids self-defense, a headlock is probably one of the most common problems they're going to deal with. And learning to respond properly in that situation, like you said, that's probably one of the first things to do. As a human being, there is something very intuitive about grab the other person by their head if you don't know any jiu-jitsu at all. And so I can see why kids would gravitate towards that. But like you said, that maybe is an area where we can focus on giving them good habits. Now, I also want to ask you about development stages. When you are teaching a room full of adults, you are teaching a room full of people who have gone through their, body development. They have fully functional cerebrum. With children, you don't necessarily have that, right? These kids are still very young. They don't have fully developed minds at this point. And so you're dealing with a different level of cognitive capacity with kids, and they have to be reached differently. What have you found in that capacity?
Yeah, so kids they think slower, and you can usually see the difference between, because we take kids as young as 3 years old in our classes. So you can see a big difference between a 3 and a 4-year-old versus like a 5-year-old. 5-year-olds kind of start to, sometimes they come in and like the next class, it's a big shift and they've reached a new developmental stage, and they're thinking in as fast as a 6-year-old would, and then 6 to 8. And so, we could go on and split it up, but really the main idea is like kids do not think and they don't process as fast as adults would. They're running 3 to 5 seconds behind, sometimes longer. You'll ask a kid a question and they're not there, and then they'll answer you, a few seconds later. And when they're in battle, when they're grappling, it's especially easy to see. They say a kid knows to sprawl, but they'll sprawl so late that, it's absolutely ineffective. And it's not that their timing is bad. It's just like they don't necessarily process it as quick as they need to. They don't remember that they need to sprawl until it's too late. And so with that was another reason to sort of simplify techniques early on so that the kids could actually think. So even in coaching cues, if you're coaching the kids with complicated things when they're in the middle of a match, it's not that they're not listening. It's not that they don't want to listen. It's not that they're being poorly behaved. It's that they can't process what you're saying. It's too much information. And so simplifying your commands to 1 to 2 word things and repeating it, so like balance, if you're on top, just keeping that in their head, kind of letting them do their thing, not trying to walk them through a complicated submission trying to walk them through Americana, but just like balance, stay on top, hold your balance, don't fall over, things like that have kind of cut through and they can start to handle that amount of information.
I think most jiu-jitsu coaches make their instruction way too complicated, and maybe you can slide past when you're doing adult class, but with kids, that's going to be super pronounced. If you are trying to teach someone how to do a jiu-jitsu move and you start getting really specific, like put your left hand on the fabric behind their right knee and now put your right hand on their left hip, and you start doing stuff like that, man, you've already lost most of the room when you're talking to adults. I can only imagine how hard that's got to be when you're talking to kids. And so I'm presuming that the way that you give instructions has to be significantly simplified for kids as well.
Yeah, for sure. So especially on the fundamental side, we teach things in flow, and, so they do a takedown, then they get to side control, then they have to do an escape. And that sequence there is repeated, for like the standing portion of class, every single class. And so eventually they catch on and they get pretty good at it, but they're taught the moves like a side control escape over the course of weeks. rather than trying to get all of it in one class. We run the same class structure for one unit. And so let's say unit 1 has like double leg takedown to side control, and then the person escapes to close guard, for example. And that's taught over the whole course of a week. And then a few weeks later, they're seeing that exact same sequence. And so the frequency of how often they're seeing it and then how long it's taught for has to be there. And then in each individual class, keeping the moves down so that if it's a complicated move like a knee escape, so getting up to your knees and grabbing a single leg from the bottom of side control, for example, they have to punch in an underhook, and then they have to bridge, they have to slide down, they have to turn to their stomachs and lock that single. Breaking that down into 3 steps is kind of my general goal. Anything more than 3 steps, they start to lose it. And you can mash steps together. You can say, okay, now turn your knees and grab the single leg. And that's all and show it. And that's all 1 step. But if you break that into 2 steps, well, then it falls apart, So 3 steps would be what I would say. Because they can certainly start to handle the more advanced moves. Not that that's an advanced move, but like a more advanced sequence. But assuming it's broken down into manageable pieces and then having them teach it back to you. So like I show the move twice, and then the 3rd time through, they have to tell me what to do. Okay, what do I do first? Okay, punch your arm through. Okay, so I got my arm through. What's next? Okay, big bridge. And then, okay, what's next? Get to your knees and grab the single leg. And then, and then suddenly they're doing it pretty well. So it's how you chunk the things and then how often they're seeing the move. And so there's a lot of pieces there, but being able to read the room and seeing how well they're picking it up is going to be important.
I get people all the time who on this podcast, they'll start getting really detailed with something, and they'll start explaining something like, if I put my hand here and my leg here, and I'm just thinking, man, I'm already bored. And I've been doing jiu-jitsu for almost 20 years, and you've already lost me. This is just not an effective way to communicate, giving people all of these incredibly specific details. That's a tough way to get information out of one brain and into another. If the way that you teach jiu-jitsu reads like an IKEA instruction manual, where it's these incredibly nuanced, specific steps, I think there's room for improvement there. I much prefer starting with why and explaining what the goal is and giving people some ideas that can help them figure out the optimal solution on their own and arrive at the same place. If you start with all of those hyper-specific details, even with adults, it's hard to maintain the attention span and to transmit all of that knowledge and to keep it memorized. You want to probably back up and simplify your thinking and your explanations, and I can only imagine with kids that's even more important.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Relating it to, and all those details are super important. Like they are absolutely going to be relevant, but maybe not relevant now for the kids. Like learning to read, you learn your ABCs, and then you learn simple words, and then you start learning simple sentences, and then pretty soon you're reading very complicated things. But when you first start, like you really have to just think about the letters, and it takes a lot of effort to learn those letters. And like, there's 26 things. Like, how am I ever going to memorize that? That's so much. And then pretty soon, like, you got this whole language that you can speak. Teaching jiu-jitsu is really like teaching that language, and I know we've certainly talked about jiu-jitsu being like its own language and the language of moving bodies and things like that. You got to teach them the language. If you're trying to teach them, give them a novel right away, or even a children's book, it's too much. You start with your ABCs and your simple words, and you just let them make a ton of mistakes, and they get it.
Now, the previous time you came on the podcast, you said something really cool. I clipped it out and I put it on social, and people seem to really respond to it. You talked about framing the whole process of like tapping and trying again as respawning. And I guess I should kind of approach the Luddites here. For people who don't know, in video games, respawning is like when you die, you get to try again. You come back and you get to try one more time. And I love that framing, especially for kids. First of all, because it teaches them that losing isn't the end of the world, and it reframes losing as I get another chance. I come back and I try again. Losing, it doesn't have to be this scary thing. It's part of this process. But also, it meets the kids where they are. You're taking something that is already a touch point for them, something they understand, and you're meeting them there and bringing them into the world of jiu-jitsu. And I think that's got to be much more helpful than just trying to offload all of the jiu-jitsu terminology onto these poor kids when they don't even know what's going on. If you can frame things in terms of their existing, already limited world experience and help them understand how how that relates to jiu-jitsu. I thought that was a very clever way of framing things. First, because it's something that the kids will understand, but also it reframes one of the scariest parts of jiu-jitsu in such a way that it's not scary anymore. Talk about that process. Like, what are some of the findings you have for how to create these effective language cues for kids? And how do you use those in jiu-jitsu? Maybe some other examples of good language cues that resonate well with children.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Steve. I appreciate the mentions. So being able to relate to kids is huge in class, because not only does it help you build rapport with them, but like you're able to start to speak the same language, especially nowadays with all the kids on YouTube and the things that they're on. They're using all sorts of things, the 6-7 phenomenon and all that stuff. If you can learn some of these things and not necessarily in a cringy way, but in a way that they will be able to relate to and understand those concepts, then it's going to really help solidify stuff for them. So as much as I can, I try to not use fancy jargon. They have to learn the jiu-jitsu words for things, like they got to learn escapes and like pins, passing the guard. They have to learn that terminology. We can't just say, we're not making up all new jargon for stuff. But for the concepts, that's what we can relate to in their language. And so the big one that we were just talking about was respawning. Since kids have such big emotions, and that's another big factor in teaching kids, it can't be so catastrophic, because their emotions are going to take over. And then, like, depending on the kid, because every kid's different, that could be enough to have them out of class. Like maybe they're not trying hard anymore for the last 15 minutes of class because they just lost that match, or their face was crushed too hard when resisting the choke. And if they could learn to just tap and respawn, then they can go again. It's like a video game. But if they hold out and not tap, because kids hate losing, and so they have to be able to understand that the tap is a respawn, and that when they respawn, they get to come in with full health. Then, they're ready to fight the final boss again with a full health bar. But if they refuse to tap and they get hurt, because whether it's an arm bar or whatever it is, or they're too angry now because they were getting hurt a little bit, then they're coming into that next respawn, the next life, with already like half their life meter taken down. And they're like, oh, like, I don't want that. Like, I got to come in with, my full health bar. And so that's one way to try to relate to them, because kids love to yell, like, oh, because their pride's on the line. They know if they tap, they lose. And so rather than tapping, they'll start screaming. They'll say, stop, stop, stop. And they'll get all mad, and they'll try to, throw their partner on the bus. Oh, he wouldn't let go. I was saying stop. I'm like, why were you saying stop? Why didn't you tap? Well, I didn't want to lose. Okay, well, I mean, if you're caught, you got to tap. You can bring that in for them, and hopefully they can understand that. And so they can fight again and not get caught up in the emotions and the hurt and the fear.
Nice. Now, you had talked about kids and, of course, catering around their limitations, but I think it's also easy to underestimate kids. Anyone who's got kids understands this, right? Yes, they do seem silly and goofy, and it can be harder to teach them some things, but it's also easy to get into this trap where you think, well, the kids just can't do stuff because they're kids. It's easy to underestimate them. And I think that ultimately, if your goal is to build these kids into lifelong athletes and jiu-jitsu fans, you've got to see their potential and help them reach that. You've talked before about how sometimes kids do get underestimated, and how we can actually raise the level a bit, and that should be the goal, just like with any grown-ups. Maybe expand on that a little bit. What exactly does that mean?
So, we've been talking about how kids are different, how they are floppy and stuff like that, but like, really, kids are absolutely incredible, and they're capable of so much. I mean, we send kids to the Olympics. We have, for like gymnastics, for example, they have to be at least 16 to go to the Olympics. But there are kids out there that are younger than that certainly could compete at that level. And it's not like they turned 15 and then suddenly they're competing like a world champion gymnast, right? I mean, they have been doing amazing things all the way up. So it's how they get taught. And so we have very high standards in our school for technique, but just not right away. The fundamental side is where they learn the rough sketch and where they learn how a jiu-jitsu battle is supposed to go. And then again, we hold them to a high standard, just not giving them a ton of technique to do. Once they start to get over to the intermediate side and, maybe even towards our advanced students, we have very high standards for our technique. We teach the kids leg locks. I don't teach them, but I allow the kids to wrist lock each other just so that they can learn. I mean, because they don't have great setups, they quickly get their arms straight, and you just show them, defend, like, don't let your wrist bend so much. much. Like, don't just let them move you however they want. And so I use the threat of the kids trying to wrist lock each other so that they learn to just not be as floppy. I have kids that are pretty good at their ashigramis, their X guard game, their ankle locks. I have a kid that does reverse X, and he puts people into inside senkaku. I don't let them heel hook each other in class, but any sort of white belt legal submission for the legs, the kids are able to go for, so they clover leafs like the other kids and stuff like that. And so there's kids that are doing really high level jujitsu and hold them to a high standard. Like, I have kids that roll, like they're blue belts and purple belts, even though they're only 10 or 11 years old. It's just about building them up in a proper way, giving them progressions to work through, the level of understanding, just like what to fight for first. And then, once that rough sketch is clean, then starting to give them the high level technique.
Now, I'd love to get into some specifics here about the way that you use some of your language, because I agree with you completely. I mean, something that you've said here, and I think is so true, and everyone should always remember, kids have big emotions. And look, it's not just kids, right? I get enough mail from people to understand that, look, adults have emotions too, and often our emotions get in the way of our jiu-jitsu performance. So even adults are not immune to this, but kids especially, they don't quite have emotional regulation yet. And all of these emotions they're feeling are still very new to them. It's easy for them to get carried away like in a storm or wave of emotions. And if that happens, then you've got to help get them regulated again and bring them back. And it can be challenging. So I think so much of how that we teach kids, although again, adults as well, it comes down to, can we help manage their emotional state, help them get to a place where they see this as a positive, happy learning experience, so they're primed for those good learnings. Now, on that topic, we talked about cues that you can use to simplify the goals that you're trying to give to people. I love collecting good jiu-jitsu cues. We interviewed Nick Winkleman, the author of The Language of Coaching, ages ago. I'd love to get him back on the podcast to talk about this, because he explained the importance of what makes for a good cue. Like, how do you set up a cueing language so that people understand just intuitively what the goal is and they do the right thing? With kids, you're dealing with limited vocabulary, so that's even more important. What are some of the cues that you use to help teach kids good jiu-jitsu without maybe them even realizing what you're doing?
So I wrote down a list of cues, and just as examples that I like to talk to with the kids. A lot of them have to do with guard retention. So our program is entirely no gi for our kids. And so we don't really have gi grips and things to deal with. And so the guard retention happens very quickly. And so they need good cues that they can understand and learn, because they're, everything is happening fast. And so one I use is like feet lasers. And so just so that they learn that their feet need to be pointed at their opponent. And, and I use little sound effects and like pew, 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 like you make sure you're shooting your opponent wherever they turn, like make sure your feet are shooting them. Don't have them too high. Don't have them too low. If they point off to the side, you need to fix it. Like, shoot your opponent. And then their opponent the passer has the direct understanding that, okay, I need to not let their feet shoot me. If their feet are pointed at me, then, well, that's a problem. I'm going to have a hard time passing their guard. There's attacks that they can do. And so they just have that one battle there where the top player is practicing not letting their feet shoot them, and then the bottom player has to keep their feet shooting them. And then that goes into the backup lasers, which are your hand lasers and your knee lasers. So once the feet get moved, your hands and your knees start, they have to shoot your opponents, and then you can use like a high leg or whatever to get back so that your feet are shooting again. A big piece of that is understanding, like, just because they haven't passed your guard doesn't mean, like, if your feet aren't pointed at them, like, you're kind of in defensive position. You're using your backups. You need to get back to your primary weapons.
That's a great cue. And I like how you've adapted it for kids, because I've heard people use similar cues for grownups, but they'll often talk about it as like knee headlights. Think of your knees like headlights, and you want to keep your opponent within your headlights. And that's just a fancy way of saying, don't let them clear your knees. It's a good cue for grownups who understand the context of, I'm driving a car. A kid isn't necessarily going to understand that. So converting that cue to something that is in their language, like knee lasers, that I think is great, because that intuitively meets them where they are.
Yeah, one of our other favorites is dead cockroach. And so they learn the knee elbow frame and how to support that, and, butterfly guard or closed guard, and how to keep their knees and elbows together. But we don't use the knee elbow frame. We don't use that terminology. We just use dead cockroach, and we show them how to maintain that position. And, we quickly remind them, so if they're in the middle of a battle, and they're looking ridiculous and trying to reach out and extend and grab the person's leg with their toes, which happens because they want to sweep them. You got to be, oh, dead cockroach. And you can give them that visual cue that has a picture associated with it so that they can get back to where they want to go. And I would say that would probably be one of the biggest things, because I'm sure everyone has their own cues. I try to pick ones up as much as I can, but it should have a picture that the kids can easily recognize, and they can make their body into that picture, that shape.
Yeah. Have you found a way to use 6-7 as an external cue yet? Have you encountered a position where the hand placement is exactly 6-7? I mean, I'm thinking maybe if you're trying to do some sort of standing scoop to pass someone's guard, you could maybe pull that off, but I'm curious.
I haven't given them that analogy, or I haven't figured out a specific cue yet, but I will allow, I'll put out like, oh, hey guys, like they're like, how many are we supposed to do? I'm like, do like 6 or 7 of them. I don't know. And give them a chance to do their thing.
Is that still a thing? Because my daughter, she went through the whole 6-7 thing. And then after a few months, she informed me 6-7 is now cringe. And I think that is because all of the grownups adopted it. And look, once you've got the Pope doing things, it's no longer like something for kids anymore. But she recently explained to me it's come back around again, and kids are now readopting 6-7 because it is a way for them to find common ground with all of the old people like us who have caught up to them and understand 6-7. So it's like 6-7 is now a generational gap they use to relate to their parents.
That's amazing. So yeah, the older kids definitely had dropped 6-7, but the younger kids, the 5 and 6-year-olds, like they're still going strong with 6-7 and doing the hands and the dance and things like that.
I also like the dead bug example that you gave, dead cockroach or whatever you have. I've always called it dead spider, but really it's intuitive, right? We're talking about a bug that when it dies, it curls up and its limbs come in.
Yeah.
As grown-ups, we can sit here and we can talk about like closing your elbow knee space, but that's never been a great cue. I mean, it's a good way to descriptively describe the why behind what we're doing, but it's not a great cue, right? Saying close the elbow knee space is not efficient. Just saying dead bug or dead spider or dead cockroach is an easier way to do that. I think, again, great example of stuff that relates to kids here. As we get close to the end of this though, Brennan, I want to give you the opportunity to give me kind of an overarching theme of your philosophy. Because I know that one of the things that you've got, which I think is maybe different from a lot of other people, you look at kids teaching from like almost a completely different philosophical lens. What would you say is like the summary of your core philosophy for how to teach kids? What would you, time machine, you can go back and you can talk to the you from 10 years ago. What would you tell yourself about how to more effectively reach kids if you only had like 3 to 5 bullet points to do so?
Oh, man. So kids are amazing. Getting to teach them is like teaching them to be, like growing them up to be actual martial artists. Like you can teach them the philosophy of martial arts. You can teach them the techniques. You can teach them how to fight. But it's really, and you can teach them how to be athletes, so the whole thing, like little Shaolin monks, you really get to do that with kids more than you do with adults. Adults are like, oh, I want my hobby and it's jujitsu. Whereas kids, like you can really, like you have the jujitsu philosophy and you have, again, you can build them into little athletes and you can get them competing and teach them how to use the martial arts to get them going in life lessons. So one of the biggest things I think if I had to go back, I would say to like get, solid curriculum of mat chats sooner, so that they're actually learning, some of these things, and write down like what are the core philosophies that you would want a good martial artist to know, so that you can start teaching it to kids.
Yeah. I also think that as a kids coach, people need to understand the importance of that role. With so many gyms, the kids program is almost an afterthought or something that people look at as like a burden, something they don't want to do. And like you said, the common meme is, you point some blue belt to teach the kids class because you don't want to do it. You don't want to deal with the kids. I think that is completely the wrong mental approach to bring to something like this, to the point where honestly, if that is the way that you look at the kids class, you would be doing everyone a better service by just not teaching a kids class, right? I mean, if to you a kids class is a burden, you should just take it off of the calendar because you're not helping anyone, especially the kids. One of my friends, Nick Perler, wrestling coach out of the States, has said that, he had to realize that for a lot of the kids in the room, he's probably the closest thing they have to a father figure, right? You don't know the life circumstances of all of these kids. You, as their coach, have a tremendous opportunity to reach people and change lives in a way that is rarely given to you. And if you look at the kids program as this pain in the ass thing that you have to do that you don't enjoy doing and you don't really care about, and it's an afterthought, then man, you're missing out on the real opportunities that come behind a kids program. With kids, you want to be taking a long view of these kids, right? Not just this is a daycare that they're going to be in for the next 1 or 2 years, but rather this is the beginning of a journey that they may follow through the rest of their lives, right? These kids that you're training now, 10 to 15 years later, they may be your star athletes, right? They may hang around. They may wind up working at your gym. They might wind up taking your job at some place, right? I mean, when you're too old to do this anymore, you hire one of your students who's now a black belt. That is a tremendous responsibility. And it is an honor and it is a privilege, and it should be looked at that way. And I think that, man, if you're coming at this from the perspective of like, oh, the kids class, I hate doing that, just take it off of your schedule because you're not doing anyone any favors.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the kids pick up on that too. They know when someone doesn't want to, put the time in for them. That's really important.
Fantastic, man. Well, I appreciate this greatly. If people want to train with you at Rochester Jiu Jitsu or follow you, how do they do that?
So my Instagram is Coach Brennan Strimple. Look me up, follow me, whatever. And then our school is Rochester Jiu Jitsu. No, we're in Irondequoit. We're by House Guitars.
Awesome. I will put links to all of that in the show notes to make it easy for people to find. I'll also throw a link to our stuff there. It's all at bjjmentalmodels.com. If you want the free stuff, this podcast, our mini episodes, our newsletter, all worth your time, all completely free, no ads. And if you want to level up with us, check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. You'll get access to the world's largest audio library of jiu-jitsu masterclasses. We cover a wide gamut of stuff, not just the technical aspects of how to get better at individual stuff, but we get real conceptual, we get even philosophical sometimes. And we try to talk about tactics and strategy in a way that other folks don't when it comes to how they teach jiu-jitsu. We also have an amazing gamut of courses on important topics that tend to get missed, like how to build confidence, how to hesitate less when you're grappling, how to succeed on the business and career side of jiu-jitsu. All of that's included in one single easy subscription, and you can try it free. So go to bjjmentalmodels.com if you want to do that, and I will throw a link to that in the show notes, plus your stuff, Brennan. And thank you again for doing this, man. I love highlighting and showcasing the kids' jiu-jitsu side of things because I think there's so much that the rest of us can learn just from seeing how people like you think about how to teach kids. There's some lessons that definitely we can draw parallels to, and we can benefit the grown-ups as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And thank you for having me, Steve.
Most welcome, my friend. Thank you. And thank you to the listeners as well. We will talk to you in the next episode. See you then.